In this episode of Narrative Mechanics, I'm going to discuss a topic that is both deceptively simple and also intriguingly enigmatic, and that is the Dramatica quad. And I'll be answering the questions, what is it, and why is it important to narrative? To find out, let's take a look at where the Dramatica quad is most familiar to people in the Dramatica table of story elements. And here you see that the table is divided into 4 families: universe, physics, mind, and psychology, which is very much like the periodic table of elements in chemistry that has families like the rare earths or the noble gases. And you'll find in the periodic table in chemistry that elements such as fluorine and chlorine, they're close together and they have similar traits. They're within the same family, not identical, but similar. They're a lot different than elements such as gold or uranium, which are in other families. In the Dramatica table of story elements, all of the ones in universe pertain to stories that are about a fixed state of things. The problem that drives the story forward is a fixed state of things, like being stuck in a cave or being the elephant man where your body is unchangeable and you have to deal with it. Physics is about external activities such as a race across country that you're trying to win, or trying to achieve a diploma through study. Mind is about a fixed mindset. Could be a prejudice, or it could be, like with the Christmas Carol, Scrooge, he has this attitude towards other people that translates over into Christmas, and until he changes that mindset, the problem cannot be solved. And finally, there's the psychology family of problems, which is a lot like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, in which they're all trying to manipulate each other. Or it could be like Hamlet, where he overthinks the plumbing. It's his thinking, his psychology, not his attitude. His head's in the right place. But it's his thinking that screws up because, well, I can't get my revenge now on him because he's praying. And what kind of a revenge would that be? He'd go to heaven. Well, he has this opportunity many times, and in the end, he actually is unable to achieve his vengeance, and he dies. That's why it's a tragedy. So you can think about this table as giving you an indicator that all the problems that you can see in stories that are what the story is about, or in real life, there are 2 external kinds of problems and 2 internal kinds of problems. And there are universe and mind, which are fixed states of things, and physics and psychology, which are processes, activities. So any kind of problem you can encounter in fiction or real life is going to be either an internal or external state or process. Describes pretty much all the kinds of problems you can find, all the kinds of solutions you may look for to solve them. Now, if you look at this 3D projection, you can really see an idea of how the families work. They have families, and underneath them are subfamilies. So the quad of universe, physics, mind, and psychology, universe, that one family member, has a quad directly below it. And the same is true for all the others. And each one of those has a quad below them. Families, subfamilies, sub-subfamilies. Turns out that there's a relationship that occurs between the families and the subfamilies. For example, past is to universe as memory is to mind. Basically, that means that the relationship between past and universe and memory and mind is an identical relationship, just in 2 different places of the chart. And so we learned something right now about the quads, is that they're not arbitrary. Position has meaning. Vertical position has meaning. Horizontal position has meaning. And a way to look at that horizontal position within a family, let's take physics and psychology. We can look at doing and say that doing is to obtaining, moving across rather than up and down, is the same in physics as being is to becoming in psychology. So again, the angle at which these things happen holds meaning. It's the vector between these 2 kinds of psychological processes in psychology, these 2 kinds of physical processes within physics. That relationship is the same because the vectors are the same. And that's kind of how the chart was created. We ended up having to go from the top to the bottom over a period of 3 years and find semantics that match those relationships all the way from the top to the bottom, all the way from side to side, so that wherever in this model you put a vector, even from something way in the back to something way in the front at a lower level or a higher level, if you take that same vector that has the same length from the middle of one item in a family to the middle of another item in a family, even if it's a different size, you take that vector and move it anywhere with that same distance throughout the model, and the semantic difference will be the same between those two items as these two items. That took almost 3 years to figure that out, because in the English language, sometimes there just aren't words to describe these kinds of relationships. But at the heart of it, all of it, is this quad. And you kind of have to ask yourself, why a quad? Why 4 items? Why not 3 or 5 or 7 or some other number? Well, as it turns out, the world is built on 4s. For example, we're all familiar with the 4 primary dimensions in which we live: mass and energy, space and time. Especially if you're a Star Trek fan, you know all about these things, or if you're a fan of good old Einstein. Mass and energy and space and time. They are the only 4 dimensions that we can perceive directly or indirectly. All the rest we have to calculate that maybe they exist. Dimension 5, dimension 9, how many, multiverses. We can calculate it, but we can't perceive it. These are the only ones that we can perceive directly or indirectly in our lives. Now, I know you're going to say, oh, here we go, going deep into the science. And we are just momentarily, but we're going to carry this list from science down to things that happen in stories and in real life, bit at a time. So if you look from all of that dimensions, there are 4 fundamental forces in the universe, according to science. They are the strong, weak, electromagnetism, and gravity. Those are the 4 forces. Strong and weak deal with the nucleus of an atom, basically. They deal with neutrons and protons, and the strong forces deal with how they may transmute one to another. The weak forces deal with radioactive decay. But then over on this side, you've got things that are harder to get your head around. You can sort of get strong and weak. Electromagnetism, this whole spectrum of stuff, broadcasting everywhere, and gravity that permeates everything and warps down into that gravity well that we've seen from Einstein's theory and general relativity was that theory. You look at mass and energy and space and time, and it has the same kind of relationship among those 4 items. The first 2 are the meat and potatoes. It's very easy to say mass and energy. You can use energy to move mass around and build a brick wall. You can take a billiard ball and hit it and impart kinetic energy to it, and it rolls. But space and time, that's where it's a little harder to get your head around. And the same thing with strong, weak electromagnetism and gravity. It's a little harder to get your head around. Well, that doesn't stop there. Even simple things like the 4 states of matter. Again, 4. Why does 4 keep coming up? Solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Once again, the ones on the left are kind of material. You can hold them in your hands, okay? Gas and plasma, they're more ethereal, just like space and time, electromagnetism, gravity. All of these sets of 4 have something in common. The ones on the left, they're things that work off each other, but they are all in one kind of level of consideration, or one fractal dimension, or one level of thought. And then you have the ones on the right, which are very expansive. It's hard to get your head around. A real brain buster on some of these. Let's keep going and see what happens. Earth, water, air, and fire. Those are the 4 elements that Native Americans have always seen as being what our environment is made of. And yogis will tell you that earth, water, air, and fire are the 4 elements that you need in order to achieve transcendental thought or reach an epiphany. Earth, water, air, and fire were the 4 elements that were recognized in alchemy. That's what they saw as the world being made up of. And it all came from the ancient Greeks, who saw earth, water, air, and fire as being the 4 dimensions. All of these great thinkers in all of these areas, whether they were cockamamie or not, came down to the fact that there were 4 elements that had this kind of relation. So earth and water is very much like solid and liquid. Air and fire is very much like gas and plasma. Now, I have to say a little thing about the ancient Greeks. They didn't think of air as being the gas. They thought of air as being like the ether. Every place there wasn't earth, water, or fire was air, the ether. And then other versions of that now have said earth, water, ether, and fire no, air, the gas makes more sense. It's air and fire, but we're going to have this other thing called space, which is the ether. So they've all mixed it all up. But it comes down to, if you look at the pattern, 2 on the left, 2 on the right. The ones on the left are more tangible, the ones on the right are not. Believe me, this is all about why the quad is a quad. Noun, verb, adjective, adverb. What could be more simple than that? Well, I'll tell you. Adverb, that took me forever to figure out in school. I didn't get it, and I'll tell you why. Noun and verb, pretty easy. That's a thing, a rock, Joe, a man, whatever. And the verb, rock, the rock rolls. Okay, that's a noun and a verb. Fine. Adjective, okay, now we're in a different level of thinking. We're no longer talking about the thing and the action, mass and energy, strong, weak, solid, liquid, earth, water, noun, verb. We're talking about adjective, and they told me in class that meant that it modified the noun. Okay, I could see that. The red rock rolls. Okay, there we got an adjective, noun, and a verb. And now the adverb, they said, modifies the verb. The red rock rolls gaily. Okay, what the hell? That's not a modification. That's an effusive quality that it now projects. It is giving off a nature or a substance or an experience of doing it gaily, which is not modification. Is like when you say, of all the things it might be, let's narrow it down. It's this. It's red. Okay, we got that. The red rock, and it rolls. Okay, gaily? Where's that come from? Well, it turns out that I finally figured out, I think it was in my 20s, that this was dealing with quantity in adjective and quality in adverb, not just a modifier. Two different kinds of modifiers, perhaps, or one that they really aren't modifiers, but one is saying, here's this tangible item on the left, here is this process that it puts it in motion, and then there's something that specifies the kind or quantity of the noun, and the adverb gives you the quality. And so it's like, okay, I finally get adverbs. But now we end up in stories with the same kind of thing. We've got characters and plot. Everybody's talking about characters, plot. They're the, Spock. Characters, plot, Spock. Okay, but they are the ones that are tangible. Earth and water, solid, liquid, mass, energy, noun, verb, strong, weak, characters, plot, all the same thing. The second half of those group of 4, theme and genre, try to define them. It's hard, okay? One of them seems like it's sort of touchy-feely, and the other one seems like, well, I'm not quite sure what it is. It's indistinct, okay? Characters, plot, theme, and genre. One thing we did find out was that the one at the very end seems to be the wankiest of all. So the one on the left, the thing and the force, okay? And the next one, okay, we got something that's like that adjective. It's a modifier. We can look at it that way. But then there's this genre, adverb, fire, plasma, gravity, and time. Those are the ones that are the brain busters, okay, at the very end. So those are why there's a quad, is because quad seems to be that when we get down to the heart of anything, that's the way people look at things. And when we were trying to get at the heart of how stories work, it turned out that it all fell into 4s. Okay. Now let's put these items into quads that we just saw, those groups of 4. And we can see that mass and solid and noun and strong and earth and characters all go in the upper left. And that's true of every quad in Dramatica. When you look at the narrative of fiction or the narrative of real life, it's the same chart. It shows how our minds work, and it shows that we always put the things that are easiest in one place in our thinking. And so anytime you have a group of 4 things, you'll find that they make the most sense if you position them in the ways that you think about them. So all those go in the upper left. That way every quad operates the same. Operates. It's a keyword we'll see later. A quad is not a thing, it's an operation. We can put energy and weak and liquid and water and verb and plot there in the lower right, creating kind of a relationship between them, a diagonal relationship that we see in the 4 groups, the groups of 4 that we just looked at. Now, if we add in the others that are the second half of it, you can see that they complete the quad by putting one group that's upper left to lower right. That pairing are the meat and potatoes guys that you can hold in your hand or get your head around. And then the other line is the ones that are more esoteric or require a higher level of thinking or a more expansive perspective, however you want to look at it. And the one on the lower left, Time, plasma, adverb, gravity, fire, genre, all those things are the wankiest of the lot of four. Which of these things is not like the others? Okay, if we look at physics close up, we can see that it has, in that particular family, it's one class, four types, 16 variations, and 64 elements. Physics. Mind, psychology, and universe also have one class, four types, 16 variations, and 64 elements. And the bottom are the elements of character. That's the lower level, the things characters are made of. They're elements. They create the chemistry of characters. That's how they work. We intuitively know that, and the chart reflects that. At the next level above that, we've got plot. I'll tell you why it's up there and not the next one in a minute. Plot. There are four types of plot in each of the families. Now, we're not talking about the specifics of what happens in every scene, and then you got a plot twist and a turn. A lot of that's storytelling, but if you strip it away and go with just the stuff that is the structural components of the narrative structure, you'll find that there are only 16 types of plots that there are at that high level. There's plots about doing things, plots about understanding things, learning things, obtaining things in physics, and mind and psychology and universe have four each as well. So when you're building a narrative, you're going to want to pick the one that's like the narrative you want to create. Or if you're analyzing a narrative in fiction or real life, you want to figure out which of these 16 types out of the four classes are the ones that are operative. Which one is operative in this particular narrative? You're essentially sequencing the genome of a narrative when you determine which one it's operating on. So first you go for the class, then you subdivide it to the subfamily, and you go for the specific type. Now, theme is that next level there, right next to characters, between plot and characters is theme. And you see they're called variations of a theme. And there are a total of 64. And this is where you find things like faith versus disbelief, and hope versus hopelessness. They're the kinds of human considerations that we run into all the time in our own lives, and we see others dealing with all the time, and great stories are told about them, and real world narratives are built about what is the way this is working at this thematic level. Now, what's theme? It's the touchy-feely part, the first of the touchy-feely. So characters and plot, they're separated because they're the ones in a diagonal, characters and plot, and then theme and genre, they're the other pair, theme and genre. And so this quad that goes from top to bottom is actually like a sideways version of the quad that we're looking at with doing, obtaining, understanding, and learning. It's only the vertical wise. Well, we didn't understand when we built this what it all meant, but we knew that that's where it was operating. So here's this quad that you can look at flat, but you can also look in the table of story elements and see that that represents the the levels of all these different four families. Hold on a second, slow computer. So I think it's a good thing right now to tell you a little bit about how this Dramatica structural model was created. This will take just a moment, but I think you'll have a good idea. And if you want to know more about any of this stuff or how it was created, there's all kinds of links down below in the description, including a link to an article called Dramatica, How We Did It, which takes you step by step through everything we went through, and it's kind of a fun, jolly ride. It's kind of like we're imagining ourselves the Crick and Watson of discovering the DNA of story, and this takes you through our entire journey, just like Crick wrote this book about how they went through and finally came to this idea and tried this model and that model and had industrial tinker toys that they're putting in. Was it a single helix? That seemed to answer some things, and then came up with the idea of the double helix, and they looked at it and they said, that just feels right. And then from that, they went out and checked what was going on. That just feels right. And then they went and they checked it. So we did kind of the same thing. We had this first thing that came up in our discussions a long time ago. Back in the 80s and early 90s, we were asking ourselves, what's going on in stories? What's driving them? And Chris came up with this question up here at the top. He said, if there's somebody like Scrooge who is causing all the problems in the story, how come he can't see it? Why can't he see it? Does he see it and just say, I know that I'm the problem, but I'm not going to. No, that's not how he plays. He plays as somebody who doesn't recognize he's the problem. That his attitude, remember in mindset, his attitude is bad. And so we asked, why can he not see it? And Chris said, I'll bet there's something psychological that happens, that we get to a certain point where something becomes a blind spot. Maybe it's like a scab on a wound we had, or something else that prevents us, filters us from seeing that what we're doing is actually causing the problems. And then we project it on everybody else and everything else, and instead of on ourselves. So we said, okay, let's go with that. And as we were looking at stories, trying to find the psychology of the main character in what we were discovering along the way, we started having all these ideas like, okay, here's something about obtaining, here's something about learning, here's something about, we took all these ideas that we would find in narratives that we were looking at that seemed to pertain to the psychology of the main character, and we put them on Post-it notes. In his office, we had a huge conference room, and one whole wall was devoted to these Post-it notes, and we filled it. We were putting all kinds of terms up every time we find something new, and after a while, we began to realize on these Post-it notes that we could group them in families, that certain things seemed to be the same kind of thing, just a slightly different flavor of it. So we'd have these Post-it notes over here, and this family over there, and this family here, and we continued to group them into families until we had quite a number of them. As you see, there's many, many quads in the model. But then we discovered that they weren't all about the main character. Some things seemed to be more about the plots. They weren't about the other characters. No, it was just more about the story itself, the psychology of the story itself. And we're thinking, what the heck is that? So we separated those out, and we put the ones about the main character in one place, and we put the ones about the story at large in another place. One day, I was sitting there looking at that wall, actually standing looking at the wall, and over there on the left where we had the ones that pertain to the story, all those families, I was looking at it, and I had the first of many epiphanies in this project. I said to myself, my God, it's full of stars. No, I said, that looks like the psychology of the story itself. Maybe the story has a psychology, the main character within the story has a psychology, but the story has a psychology. I wonder. I said, I got to ask Chris. So I went into his office, ran in there, and Chris was at his desk doing some paperwork on our theory and editing and creating graphics. And I said, you know what, Chris, I think all those things that didn't fit the main character, I think the story has a psychology of its own. It has its own mind, its own psychology as a whole. And he said, wait a minute. And then he laid down on the floor, that he always did when he was trying to grab on one of the ideas that I threw at him. And he closed his eyes and he lay there stiff as a board, just lay there for about 3 or 4 minutes. Then he opens his eyes and he said, I think you're right. And from there, the whole concept of the story mind, in which there is a main character with his own psychology, but he's also within a story mind, and that story has its own psychology, and the other characters who are not the main character act as facets of that larger mind. Well, it turned out that was the breakthrough that we needed to go much deeper into narrative theory and begin to build a functional model of it. The story mind was our concept. As a matter of fact, that's my website, storymind.com. Families and subfamilies of 4. After looking at these families we created, which may have 7 or 8 or 9 or 2 items in them, we saw that if we grouped them in 4s, they actually seem to be full and full balanced. It just worked better grouping them in 4s. We didn't know why. At that time, we didn't know about mass and energy, space-time, and all that other stuff I showed you, noun, verb. We didn't even think about that stuff. We just arrived at that by looking at what we had. And if there were only 3, we knew we needed a 4th. And we found that if we put them in certain positions, like we described, what's in the upper left, what's in the lower right, that if we created that, we could see what kind of thing we were missing in a quad. Oh, we've got this one, this one, this one, but we don't have that one. Or we've got this, and this, but we don't have that. So it allowed us to then be able to determine what was still needed and helped us find that term to put in there to complete the model semantically, which was a job in itself. Position has meaning. And we had to fill them with semantics that had identical meaning no matter how you measure them, compared to every other quad. And those vectors that I talked about before, we had to make sure they worked, so that even if things were different levels and different directions, if you took that and you moved it somewhere else, the meaning would be the same between those two semantic terms and those two semantic terms. And what were these semantic terms? They were describing psychological processes, and the model itself was a matrix that held all of the psychological processes together in a mind at rest that didn't have any problems. And that's what this model was. Now, if we look at that model, fundamental narrative elements, and we look at the quad, and we went down to the bottom and found that there were 4 elements that were the quintessential elements of psychology. They were knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Knowledge was like mass, thought was like energy, ability was like space, I'll tell you why later, and desire is like time, because, you look at the way things are, you compare to how they were and how you might want them to be. Time is integral to desire. That is the emotional component, desire, of this quad. Let's move forward. So the sets of 4 dimensions that we had before were mass and energy, space and time, strong, weak, liquid, water, noun, verb, adjectives, characters, plot. And to that we added knowledge, thought, ability, desire. They work the same way. The ones on the left were the solid ones, and the ones on the right were the kind of esoteric ones, or another dimension of thought or something that required you to do a little more work to get a grip on. Ability, by the way, I said I'd tell you later. I'll tell you now. I don't keep you hanging. Ability is kind of what you know compared to what you don't know. Everything you don't know is that open space, and everything you do know is the mass that's in it. And so when you look at that, you get a sense of ability that's kind of the product of that. And thought is the product of looking at the past and the future and comparing it to the way things are, which is why desire is kind of like, desire is like time. So knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Okay, let's move forward. Waiting for it. Okay, 4 stages of justification. First stage, knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Why are we calling them justification? Why are we talking about justification? Well, you'll see in a minute. Second stage has can, want, need, and should. Now think about it for a moment. If you're saying, can I do this? Or I need to do this, or I should do this, or I want to do this, it's no longer looking at what knowledge you have, what thoughts you have, what your ability really is, what your desires really are. Knowledge, something you really know, you're not looking at that anymore. You're looking at what you can do, which is a limitation of what your abilities might be. What you need, which is you're lacking something and you've got to get it. Because of what you want, which is I don't have that, I'm looking for it. And should, which is, well, I'd like to, but I can't because, or I'd rather not, but I must because. Okay, now don't worry about what you hear in the background. I have this little tiny studio that's on the side of Teresa's workshop, and she's got to clean up because today she rebuilt a whole wall in the patio where we have our room, and there's sawdust all over her shop, and it's getting a little late. And I have to hurry too because my daughter's coming over, and I promised her I'd make a wonderful dinner for her tonight. Now we have a few minutes, so back to this. Knowledge, thought, ability, desire, and then when you carry them a level away from those things and start bringing in limitations and other considerations, you end up with can, need, want, should. That's what we call it a justification. The third level is when you're dealing with situations, circumstances, state of being, and sense of self. Well, my gosh, now you're taking into account things that aren't even part of you. You're saying, well, what's the situation I'm in? Can I really do that within these limitations? Circumstances, well, who's going to think this way or that way about me if I do this? Anyway, what is my state of being? Who am I really? And how do I think I am? Who do I think I am? Which is what the movie, I can't remember, Lawrence Kasdan film from the 80s about them finding out they weren't who they really thought they were, but I don't remember the title. Anyway, that's the third stage. What's the fourth stage? How do you get even farther from that? Commitment, rationalization, responsibility, and obligation. Commitment is back to knowledge again, saying, I don't care what new information comes in. I've made a commitment to do this. I'm going to keep doing it. So I'm rejecting any new knowledge. Rationalization is to say, I don't care why I really originally wanted to do it. These reasons are good enough. I've got new reasons that supplanted those. These reasons make sense, even though they're not my original reasons. Responsibility is the notion that you're uniquely able, ability from number one. You're uniquely able to do something. So if that's your job to do it, you're the only one there who can do it. You start to think, all right, well, that's my responsibility. I must do it. When in fact, if you strip that away, you could just quit the job. You could walk away. If everybody would die because of it, you could still leave. You have the ability to do it, but you choose to have the responsibility not to. And obligation's the same way, is that your desires are this or that, but you're going to subjugate those desires because you don't want to hurt somebody's feelings that you care about. So suddenly you're no longer thinking about obligation, your desires, you're thinking about your obligations are, and you're so far removed from the original fundamental elements of psychology, of narrative, knowledge, thought, ability, and desire, that you can't even see them anymore. And that's how a blind spot is created. Now, Chris has a wonderful talk about that. He used to do in a presentation and show exactly step by step how these blind spots were created. But this is the pathway they take, all of them take. And at the end, you're so locked in, you can't back up. It's like a ratchet. You ratchet in, you ratchet in, you ratchet in, you build on this experience, and continue. And then there's nowhere to go. So you have to have a story where it takes something even larger and forces you to take a new path that brings you around to where you started, because you can't go home again that way. All right. Knowledge, thought, ability, desire. Imagine that. Even with knowledge, thought, ability, and desire in there as a quad, the four quads of justification are knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. And these things move. These aren't fixed on a chart. These move. Okay, hit the button. Let's wait. Come on. There you go. So narrative structure, okay, knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. Narrative dynamics are the four quads of justification, and they're the things that wind up the model like a Rubik's Cube, step by step. So narrative structure and narrative dynamics create narrative mechanics, and that's what this series is all about. Pretty amazing, isn't it? But that's not all. There are four dimensions of narrative: universe, physics, mind, physics, and psychology, knowledge, thought, ability, and desire, which we derived from it, but above it are mass and energy, space, and time. And in fact, if you look at the entire chart, up at the top are really mass and energy and space and time. And the four levels are really knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. And between the two of them, they create this narrative space. They create this mind model of narrative where mass, energy, space, and time coming down, and knowledge, thought, ability, and desire working laterally and going in that direction, they collide and create effectively the space-time continuum of the mind. And that's how it works. It's what we're seeing in space and time and what we are seeing in ourselves. So when we look outward into the world at things that are not us, I think, therefore I am, everything else is mass and energy and space and time. And inside myself, it's thought, knowledge, ability, and desire. So that's where universe comes from. That's the collision of these things coming together. It creates universe, physics, mind, and psychology, is when those four meet these four. That's how the model works. Remember, I'm just documenting this so it isn't lost when I run off into the sunset at some point and, shuffle off to Buffalo. Anyway, that's the model. So we have the narrative that is knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. But doesn't it strike you when you look at that there's some kind of math to it? I mean, isn't it intuitively feel like a math relationship? Some kind of equation might exist? Well, I decided let's take these items out and just look at the relationship. And so I was struggling. Chris had given me a deadline, and he said, basically, we have to move on. I know we both feel there's a math there, but we've got a lot of practical things, and we want to publish and want to get it in people's hands, so we can't possibly continue with this any longer than Friday at the end of workday. That's how long I give you if you haven't finished out the math, because I was the one who really wanted to get the equations figured out. He said, if you haven't got it then that's too bad. We're not going to do it. So I was trying all kinds of things. I remember one time during that week, I was with Chris at the restaurant, and I took a napkin and put A, B, C, D like that, and then I flipped it to the right like you would going backward in a book. Then I flipped it from top to bottom, and then I flipped it like it would a page with a book, and then one more time up to the top, and it came right back to the same position, which gave me the cyclic nature of how a quad is created, is that the forces within it return to where they were, but in the meantime, they iterate into these different forms, perhaps different equations. So I was thinking about all that, but then still didn't have anything. So I came back and went to those originals, and it was Friday. The deadline was an hour away. It was a hot summer day. I went back into the patio at my house and laid down on the bed and went to sleep, and I had a dream. Yeah, as hokey as it sounds, I had a dream, okay? And in this dream, I found myself in this massive open area where I could see all of the secrets of the universe. All the hidden knowledge was available to me. Is there a God? Is there life after death? What happened before the Big Bang? What does life mean? What's the meaning of life? And it was all there, and I heard a voice. I kid you not, this is how it happened. I heard a voice that said, you can take one of those pieces of knowledge back with you when you wake up, but only one. Which one do you want? Choose. So I thought about it, and I thought about it, and finally, in the end, I decided, all that other stuff is great. I gotta know what the equation and narrative is. And so when I said that, I threw myself awake. Just like you see in the movies when somebody has a nightmare and they sit bolt upright from laying down to L-shaped and they're in the bed. I threw myself awake and I had my arms around something because they had handed me something tangible. I don't know what it was. Something tangible when I wanted that information. They went out and got it. They gave it to me and I had it. And I threw myself awake, okay? And I was holding on to it. And the only thing on my mind was one side multiplies, the other divides. One side multiplies, the other divides. One side multiplies, the other divides. Running around the room looking for a paper to put it on, and I finally found a paper, and I wrote it down. One side multiplies, the other divides, and then I could let it go, okay? And when I did that, that became the basis of the equation. I applied it to these items we knew were the heart of the model, and I ended up with T over K equals dA. T over K equals dA. What does that actually mean? Well, it means thought divided by knowledge equals desirability. I mean, obviously. So I went with that, and I said, what am I going to do with that? How am I going to turn it into something useful? Because I don't really know where to go with it. And then I thought of my hero. Oh, yes. Yeah, this guy. And he gave me the clue. Not general relativity, where you talk about the gravity wells this time, but special relativity, E equals mc squared. And at the same time, we had our book that we had published, which figures out all the quads and everything. You can see it on the cover. That was published after we figured all this stuff out, of course. And you can see the relationships, and it has a sense of dynamics and the twist and turning of the Rubik's Cube and how it fits into the yin and the yang. And you ever notice that yin and yang actually has four things? It's got the one that goes this way, the one that goes that way. There's two dots in it. One dot is like the mass and energy, and the other ones are the forces that are the harder to grab on. Even the yin yang is after us, okay? So this guy said that. My dream said this. All right, fine, I understand it, but I don't understand it. It's what I was given until I multiplied each side by k in a little simple algebra to solve for t, and it came out t equals k dA. Now that's beginning to look a little suspicious as to E equals mc squared. So I thought about it, and I came to the idea that what we're talking about here is really dA is desirability. And if it was desirability, desire times ability, and we had desirability, it would have a weight of two things. And if we squared it, that would be the same as c squared. Why? Energy and mass is an Einstein C equals mc squared. Energy in ergs equals mass in grams times the speed of light constant in centimeters per second squared. Okay. And before that, he was dealing with things with momentum and stuff that got him here. But the fact is that that equation doesn't have space and time in it directly. Okay. C, the speed of light. And what is speed? It is space and time. It is distance traveled in a certain amount of time. So he has speed of light in there, and he multiplies by itself to get the right weight so that it's squared. Okay. If we had desirability and replaced it with one word, then we would also square it by itself. But here's the thing. Einstein, as within ourselves, you can only look at your inner universe from the inside out. You can't look at yourself from the outside and get a truly objective view. And Einstein could only look at the big universe from the inside out, as the rest of us can. And from that perspective, we see three things because we have to blend two of them. And the ones we blend are the ones that are the wanky ones in that line. And why do we blend them? We blend them because it gives us a platform to stand on to be able to look at the other two, so that by looking at desirability, we can measure thought against knowledge and do inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and so on, okay? But we see them as separate because we have something Einstein didn't have. Oh, yes, we do. Each one of us sees ourselves from the inside out, but we have also billions of other universes we can look at from the outside in, all the other people on the planet. We can look at them from the outside in, and it's as if Einstein was looking at many universes from the outside in which case he could have seen that, from that perspective, space and time as separate things that don't have to be combined and then squared. Okay, this is all conceptual, of course. I mean, just an introductory level here, but get your mind going. Okay, so as a result of that, when we look at the E equals mc squared and the T equals kdA, it turns out that that if you have a three-dimensional room and you have a two-dimensional man on a piece of paper with a line across it, he can't figure out how to get from there to there. But if you pick him up and put him on the other side, he'll suddenly find himself there, but he won't know how he got there and he won't be able to get back. That's what happens when you have the subjective perspective. But if you break it apart and add one extra dimension, and that's what we're doing with Dramatica and narrative theory, then you're able to actually see the desire and ability are actually separate, because you can look into other people, not just look from the inside out. Now, for the main character, they're just going to see desirability. But for the story itself, we're looking at it as if we're looking at someone else's mind from the outside in, God's eye view, author's eye view, and that is where you see desire and ability as separate. So that just gives you an idea. And because it matched sort of what Einstein was doing, talking about the relationships of these things, we thought it was appropriate to call that concept mental relativity. And we've done extensive work on mental relativity, even published a small booklet on that right around when we published the original Dramatica theory. So narrative structure looks like that. Narrative dynamics, however, was a mess, because when we looked at the narrative structure, we found that all those things appeared in stories, but because it's a mind at rest, we saw that in stories each group of four would show up, but things would move around in different patterns. Sometimes Z's, N's, starting in different places, ending in different places, U shapes, and the infamous hairpins that were kind of weird. And we tried forever, for weeks and weeks. Chris even built little children's blocks and put these words on them from the chart and tried to turn them and twist them so that we could maybe predict the order. But no matter how we looked at the narrative structure, we could not predict the order these things would go at. We kept trying to add them on there and it just didn't work. We were at a loggerheads. We were stuck, okay, just plain stuck. One day, while we were stuck, I took my young daughter out to the Museum of Science and Industry in Los Angeles at Exposition Park, and they had a display with 21 magnets on like a 2x4, all fancied up, and each one was on a little spindle, and you could turn them. And if you turned one at the end just right, you could make the second one turn, and the third one, and the fourth one, and so on, all the way to the end. You could get the last one turning. And suddenly it hit me while I was there with her. It's not that we have to figure out what's going on in stories that make these things take these odd patterns. Actually, it's the model that has to twist, and then the patterns will be normal, predictable. Okay. Many decades later, they made that Star Trek movie, the first one with Chris Pine and Simon Pegg is Scotty, and they show him from the future the equation for transporting that he was later going to figure out on his own. And he looks at it and he says, well, that's remarkable. It never occurred to me that space was the thing that was moving. And I laughed out loud because that's exactly what we discovered with the model. It wasn't that we had to track these things on the model. It's that the model was twisting and turning, and these patterns were created as a result, like a Rubik's Cube. The weird patterns you see in a Rubik's Cube are caused by the twists and the turns that you make from a cube that's already solved. This is the solved cube, what you're seeing up there right now, the one at rest, as it were. Okay. So the justification wind-up that we're talking about is they can flip in different directions, side to side, and this way, that way. Like, for example, with flipping, let me just go back one here and talk to you about that. If you have a quad that has, like it does, logic and feeling in those positions, and you're somebody who's using logic all the time to solve a problem and you can't solve it in this particular situation, it doesn't work with logic, maybe you have to go with your feelings and trust your feelings. And if you do that, then you've actually flipped that. You've put feelings on the front burner, logic on the back burner, and now you've begun to twist the model. And if circumstances work out well for you, that becomes a building block and it locks in place until you go through 4 levels of justification and you never even recall that you moved it out of place in the first place because you never thought about doing it. You just naturally, intuitively moved it back and tried the other thing on the other side. That's how we solve problems. It's the way we're built. So that kind of flipping represents that. And then you can move around it. This is like a clock. You can move that way. You can even move that way. It moves things like a snake sometimes. Other times it moves like a clock. A scream followed by a slap is different than a slap followed by a scream. A slap followed by a scream is somebody getting slapped and they scream. I didn't like that. But a scream followed by a slap could be somebody who's going hysterical and they get slapped to bring them to their senses. So the order in which you do things, if you just put noodles in a pan of cold water and then boil it up, it'll turn to mush. You've got to get the water boiling first before you can add those noodles, and then they'll be nice and al dente or however you like them, okay? So this movement in time, that actually changes the order, which can alter whether things will work or not. It has a lot to do with causality. Just a little clue for you all. So all these patterns that we saw there suddenly were understandable and were created by the model, not that we had to plot them on the model, but that the model, when twisted and turned, created these patterns in the order in which things went through. 1, 2, 3, 4 was the at-rest order that was assigned to every one of these quads. They all work the same. And when something moves out of order, well, then that creates temporal tension in the story, just like the Rubik's Cube does. And here's the last main point for this, is that the Dramatica dynamic model looked at 1 December, I was given another deadline by Chris. I know that we have to come up with what drives this model so we can create a story engine out of it that accurately represents narrative, and we can use it so that people can sequence the genomes of narratives and write their stories and do their things. And you've got till Christmas. I had to cancel a family vacation because that's what I was told to do. So as a result of it, I worked and I worked and I worked, and just before the deadline, when they said we're going to cancel the story engine part of it and just put it out as an informational thing, just before they did that, I came up with 8 different essential questions, like, does the main character change or remain steadfast at the end? Is the story driven by actions that then cause people to make decisions, or is it driven by decisions that then lead people to make actions? Does it end because of a time lock where they run out of time, or an option lock when, like in Beauty and the Beast, the last rose petal drops? These were the questions that needed to be asked. And when you asked them, it determined whether it went left or right, whether it went up or down, whether it flipped first and then rotated, or whether a quad just flipped and didn't rotate, or whether a quad just rotated and didn't flip, whether it did both or neither. Okay, you can see all those in the charts there. And then ultimately at the end, all of that came into developing this story engine that we patented that allowed us to have a predictive model of narrative for both creation and analysis that worked in fiction and the real world. Now, that's all I'm going to give you today because I don't want to overload you, but I do have some links in the description below that'll help you study further, assuming I don't get through creating more videos as fast as you like. One is that you can read the Dramatica theory book for free online if you want. Another is that you can download it in PDF form if you'd rather have it on whatever your portable device is. You can download that table of story elements I've been showing you that has those images and a lot of others that you can blow up real big. They'll be very clear, and that'll help you follow all of this. You can read that article I told you about, Dramatica, how we did it. It's rather extensive, but it's a jolly tale of an adventure of trying to find out the answers to this and how we ended up stumbling through it step by step until we actually did find the answers. You can also visit my authors page on Amazon, a link to it down there, where you can read all the books I've ever published about Dramatica and narrative theory. You can visit my blog that has things from good storytelling tricks to how make it interesting for you, all the way over to narrative science. But if you want to go deeper, go to dramaticapedia.com, which is my blog that has everything that I've ever written about narrative theory that hasn't been published. There's published stuff there too, but all the unpublished stuff is there. And so I'll leave you there this episode, having given you the overview and outline of what the quad is, why it's important, and how it works with narrative. And I'll be back hopefully soon with another episode of Narrative Mechanics to further tantalize you. Thank you for your time, and I hope all your narratives are good ones.